Masechet Gittin Daf Pe Gimel. We're dealing with an interesting case of a husband who gives a get to his wife, and he says, you are permitted to marry everyone except for this person. We'll call him Reuven. So is that a valid get or not? The Rabbanan said it's invalid that a get has to allow her to marry everyone in the world, and if he's holding back something from the get, a person, then it's not a full divorce, and therefore it's invalid, and she cannot marry anyone. It's not a get at all. However, Rabbi Eliezer said it is a valid get. So now we're going to see a beautifully structured sugya. It's going to have 5 refutations of Rabbi Eliezer. Actually, then they're going to add another one, so it's going to be 6 altogether. And then it's going to refute each of those refutations. Well, almost all of them. So we'll have a lot of back and forth. So here we go. Tenor Banan. Lachar petirato shel Rabbi Eliezer nichnesu arba'a zikanim lashib al devarav eluhen Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva. After Rabbi Eliezer died, this is the famous Rabbi Eliezer HaGadol, the one that was excommunicated in the Oven of Achnai story, the one who had tons of Torah that he learned and no one ever came to learn from him. So he was very widely respected, even though he stood his ground even when he was a minority opinion, and so that caused a controversy. But nevertheless, he was well respected for his knowledge of traditions. So while he was alive, the rabbis did not argue with him on this point. But after he died, then the rabbis gathered together, the Zikanim gathered together, and they refuted his words. And these were the 4 rabbis, Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, Rabbi Tarfon, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and Rabbi Akiva, all his students. And they refuted his words. Rabbi Akiva is actually going to have 2 refutations. That's what we're going to get to 5 in this initial list. And we'll see yet another one from Rabbi Yoshua later. Na'ana Rabbi Tarfon ve'amar, Haresh alcha zo v'niset le'achiv shel ze shene'esra alav umet belo banim. Lo nimsa ze oker davar min ha-Torah, halamadeta she'en ze kiritut. Rabbi Tarfon argues, let's say the husband gave her a get and said, you're not allowed to marry Reuven. She goes ahead and marries the brother of Reuven. We'll call him Shimon. And Shimon dies without children. Now she is going to fall to the Yavam, who is Reuven. And so now she'll have an obligation to marry Reuven from the law of Yibum. However, because the husband made this condition and said, you may not marry Reuven, she won't be able to perform Yibum. And so now we have a scenario where if you follow Rabbi Eliezer, you'll have a condition that goes against a biblical law, right? It will undo the law of Yibum. And so therefore we can learn that the Torah would not have permitted such a partial divorce because it could lead to uprooting a law in the Torah. And therefore, this Rabbi Eliezer must be wrong, and therefore, if for a divorce to work, has to permit her to everyone. All right, that's the first. Na'ana Rabbi Yosef HaGalili ve'amar, Hechad masinu asur lazeh umutar lazeh, asur lakol, v'mutar mutar lakol. Halamadeta she'en ze kiritut. Where else do you find in the Torah that there's something that's prohibited to one person but permitted to a different person? Right, pig is prohibited to everyone. Right, so if something is prohibited, it's going to be prohibited across the board. Rather, right, something that's prohibited is prohibited to everyone. Permitted is permitted to everyone. And the same thing is here. If you have this woman who got a divorce, you can say she's permitted to all men, but prohibited to Reuven. That doesn't make sense, right? We don't find categories like that divide anywhere in the Torah, and so therefore we can learn against Rabbi Eliezer that this type of divorce is not a severance and is invalid. Now the third refutation, Na'ana Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah ve'amar, Kiritut, davar hakoret beno lebena, halemadeta she'en ze kiritut. He's learning it not from logic, but from the pasuk. It says this, he has to give her a sefer kiritut, a scroll of severance, and that by definition means that it completely severs the relationship between the husband and wife. But if there still is a relationship, such that a marriage relationship by definition says you are permitted to me, and therefore you are prohibited to everyone else in the world. So if she's still prohibited to even one person, Reuven, so she's still in a sense married to her original husband with regard to Reuven. So it's not a full severance, and therefore is not a sefer kiritut. So just by definition of the word kiritut, it has to be a total severance. נענה רבי עקיבא ואמר, הרי שהלכה זו ונישאת לאחד מן השוק והיו לה בנים ונתערמלה או נתגרשה ועמדה ונישאת לזה שנאסרה עליו, לא נמצא גט בטל ובניה ממזרים, הלמדת שאין זה כריתות. Rabbi Akiva says, think about the following scenario. The husband again gives the wife a get and said, don't marry Reuven. She doesn't marry Reuven, she marries some random person, not related, Levi, and has children with Levi, and then either he dies and she's widowed or they divorce. And then after that, she goes ahead and marries Reuven, who was prohibited to her. So now, let's say it was a condition. We mentioned yesterday that there's two ways to formulate this case. Either that the husband said, you can marry everyone except that person, or you can marry everyone this is a good get, you can marry everyone on condition that you don't marry that person. So right now we're following the condition formula and explaining that this get will be retroactively nullified, because it's true, after the first get, he said you can marry everyone except Reuven. So she followed through and married someone else. So, okay, it's a good get so far. But then afterwards, she goes and marries Reuven, so that violates the condition, and now retroactively, the get was never good, and therefore she's married to the first husband, and therefore the children she has with the second husband are mamzerim. Now, would the Torah set up a scenario where after a get, she goes and marries and has children, and they will then be declared mamzerim? Can there be such a scenario? Would that really be called severance? That's not severance. And therefore, that Rabbi Eliezer must be wrong. The Torah would not allow such a scenario. Davar acher. Now, that's the first statement of Rabbi Akiva that was dependent on it being a condition. But Rabbi Akiva has another refutation that this would work for if it means chutz, you can marry everyone except. דבר אחר, הרי שהיה זה שנאסרה עליו כהן, ומת המגרש, לא נמצאת אלמנה אצלו וגרושה אצל כל אדם. Let's say he says you cannot marry Reuven, and Reuven, let's say, is a kohen. And now the original husband who divorced her dies. So, in terms of that kohen, in terms of Reuven, would she not be an almana? Because from the perspective of Reuven, she is prohibited to Reuven because of her marriage to the original husband. So in a way, from his perspective, she's still married to the original husband there, and was never divorced. So when he dies, she would be an almana for the kohen, even though she is a gerusha for everyone else, because for everyone else in the world, the get was valid. This is according to Rabbi Eliezer, the get is valid, and she can marry everyone else, and therefore she's a divorcee for everyone else. Okay, so now she has this double status, almanat for the kohen, but gerusha regarding everybody else. Now we already saw yesterday that there's a law regarding kohanim that is in a way more stringent, that kohanim cannot marry a divorcee, even if the get was just a reach get. Kohen cannot marry her. And so in this case, the kohen, in fact, will not be able to marry her, even though, because she's a divorcee for everyone else, even though for himself, she is an almana. So here's the Kal Vachomer that Rabbi Akiva is going to make to refute Rabbi Eliezer. The Kal Vachomer. Ma gerusha shehi kala. Now the prohibition for a kohen to marry a gerusha is relatively light compared to adultery. Nevertheless, asura bishvil sad gerushin sheba, the kohen Reuven is not allowed to marry her, even though for him she's an almana, but she is also a gerusha with regard to everybody else. So because of that side of her that is a gerusha, that prohibits the kohen also from marrying her. So that's the source. Eshet ish shehi chamura lo kol sheken. Then, since she is an eshet ish for Reuven, with perspective of Reuven, she is an eshet ish. Even though for everyone else in the world she is not an eshet ish, she's a gerusha, so they could marry her, so they would be able to marry her. Should we not apply the prohibition of eshet ish regarding that with respect to the kohen to everyone else also? Right? In other words, even though technically she's permitted to the kohen as an almana, nevertheless we apply the gerusha status to the kohen, and that's a light prohibition. So all the more so when it comes to a more serious prohibition of eshet ish, we should expand her status of eshet ish regarding with the perspective of Reuven to everyone else. And based on this kavachomer, she would not be able to marry anyone. So that's against the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer. So halamadata she'en ze kiritu. So we can prove from here that a partial divorce is not a valid divorce. All right, so that's the 4 sages with 5 different refutations. Amar lehen Rabbi Yoshua en mishiben et ha'ari lachar mita. Rabbi Yoshua responded to those refutations and said, we should not refute the opinion of a lion. Rabbi Eliezer was a lion in his knowledge of Torah, and when he was alive, if you want to argue against him, that's fine. He is here to defend himself. But after death, you're waiting to after he dies, and then you go and refute him? That's not proper to do. That's not respectful. And so, Rabbi Yoshua did not offer a refutation. The Gemara is going to point out in a few minutes that he actually did have his own refutation, and we'll hear about it, but he didn't want to offer it in that session. All right, and that's the end of the Baraita. Amar Rava, kulehu itlehu pircha lebar midribi Elazar ben Azariah delet le pircha. Rava says, I can refute all of those refutations, except for that of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. He's the one that learned that not from logic, but just from the pasuk, sefed kiritut, has to be a full severance. That I have no refutation for, but all the rest, I'm going to refute. Tanya namehachi, amar Rabbi Yosef, ro'eh ani et dibrei Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah me dibrei kulan. The support, the strength of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is also noted in a Baraita, where Rabbi Yosef says, I agree with the statement of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and I see that his logic better than that of all the other sages. Okay, Amar Mor. So now we're quoting the Baraita, and we're going to go one by one and refute their refutations and thereby support Rabbi Eliezer. Amar Mor. Na'ana Rabbi Tarfon ve'amar. Hareh shalcha zo v'niset le'achiv shel ze shenesra alav. Umet belo banim. Lo nimsa ze oker davar min ha-Torah. Oker ihu akar. So here's the refutation. It's going to be a few steps. Rabbi Tarfon said, if the husband said you can't marry Reuven, she marries the brother of Reuven, Shimon. Shimon dies without children, and now she has an obligation to do Yibum with Reuven, but because of the stipulation of the husband, now he cannot do that biblical, she cannot fulfill that biblical law of Yibum, and so that is uprooting law of the Torah. So we're gonna now Rava will ask about that. Okay, is the husband really uprooting? Is he doing the uprooting? It's not like he's telling her, here's a get, but you have to violate Shabbat. That would be a direct uprooting. He's not doing that. It's just passively because of a series of circumstances. He actually didn't say anything, but he didn't say don't do Yibum. Okay, so rather let's change the words of Rabbi Tarfon a little. Change the words of the refutation a little bit. Not that it's okay davar min ha-Torah. That's not what Rabbi Tarfon meant. We were changing Rabbi Tarfon's words a bit. Ela matneh la'akor davar min ha-Torah. Rabbi Tarfon's claim is that he's making a condition, and if that condition the consequences of that condition of don't marry Reuven is that could be that she will marry Shimon and then fall as a Yevamah to Reuven. So it's not that he's saying directly violate the Torah, but he's making a condition, then the condition will violate the Torah. So we ask even on that, matneh mikama la sagila de la sagila de la minaseba le le'ahu de'ahu gabra. Wait a second, this condition, did he say you have to marry Reuven? He didn't say anything like that you have to marry Shimon. He didn't say that. He said you're not allowed to marry Reuven. She went and found the brother of Reuven, right? He didn't say they have to marry her. She could have married anyone. He didn't say marry Shimon. She could have married anybody else in the world. And she chose on her own to marry Shimon, which led her to falling as a Yevama to Reuven. He didn't cause her to do that, right? She put herself into that situation. So that's not matneh. He didn't say on condition that you go and violate something from the Torah. So rather, we're going to, again, revise Rabbi Tarfon's words. Ela gorem la kol davar min haTorah. He is setting up a situation, it's true, and that could lead to a Torah law being uprooted, right? You're right. Even though he didn't command her to go against the Torah, he didn't make a condition about it, but he did say, don't marry Reuven. And it could be that she'll marry Reuven's brother and then fall to him as a Yevama, and that would uproot the Torah. And so that is enough of a refutation, isn't it? That's enough of a refutation of Rabbi Eliezer, right? So no, gorem ela me'ata bat achiv lo yisa shema yamut belo banim v'nimsa gorem la'akol davar min haTorah haynu pircha. So that's what Rabbi Tarfon said, and now we're going to refute Rabbi Tarfon and said, wait, is it really a problem to set up a situation that could cause a problem for doing yibum? If so, then there's another famous case that we've seen already that also then wouldn't be allowed. But this case is allowed, and that would be someone marrying his niece. And then if he dies without children, and that niece falls to the brother who is her father, as for yibum, and of course you can't do yibum. You don't even need to do chalisa. You do nothing at all in such a case. Even the co-wives don't have to do yibum or chalisa. So would you say that a brother should not marry his niece because maybe he will die without children, and then she won't be able to fulfill yibum? And because that will uproot something from the Torah. We don't say that. Rather, we say he can marry his niece. And if he should die without children, so then you won't do yibum. So the same thing here. He is perfectly fine for the husband to make a condition, say, don't marry Reuven. Even though it could be that she, of her own free will, may go marry Shimon, and he may not have children, and he may die, and then she won't be able to perform yibum. Okay, so she won't be able to perform yibum. There are other cases where we have permissible marriages that can lead to a situation where you can't do yibum, and therefore, haynu pircha, this is a refutation of Rabbi Tarfon's argument, right? And this is not uprooting something from the Torah. It's only causing a situation that may come to uprooting law of the Torah, but there are other equivalent cases that are permitted, and therefore Rabbi Eliezer is upheld. Okay, ubemai. Now, this refutation of Rabbi Tarfon, which formula was he assuming? If you say it's a case where the husband said you can marry anyone chutz except for Reuven, then actually Rabbi Eliezer would permit the woman to marry Reuven once she married someone else in between. De Tanya, Modeh Rabbi Eliezer b'mgaresh et ishto v'amar la harei at muteret lechol adam chutz mipeloni v'alcha v'niset le'achad min hashuk v'nit'armela o nitgaresha shemuteret lazeh shenesra alav. We have a braita. We're going to quote this braita again and then analyze it again, all on this stuff. That Rabbi Eliezer agrees that if he divorces his wife and he says you are permitted to everyone chutz except for Reuven, and she doesn't marry Reuven at that point, she goes and marries some guy, anyone, and then she is widowed or divorced. Since she already since she already fulfilled this chutz, she married someone else except for that person. So now that exception falls away, and then she can go ahead and marry Reuven. She just can't marry Reuven as the next husband, but she can marry Reuven two husbands later. So therefore, this can't be the case of it can't be that it be tarfon. Is assuming chutz, because if so, since she married Shimon's not Reuven, she's permitted to Shimon first. So after she marries Shimon, he dies, she actually would be permitted to marry Reuven, to do Yibum with Reuven. So it can't be talking about that case. It must be to be Tarfon is assuming that Eliezer said his law about Almenat Ela Be'almenat. That's the case that Rabbi Tarfon is refuting, a case where the husband said Almenat. But if it was chutz, then Rabbi Tarfon's refutation would not be valid. And in fact, for chutz, it could be a valid get. If he said you can marry anyone, chutz. So what this clause is doing, this question and answer of is it chutz or not, is in fact, in a way, limiting the refutation against Rabbi Eliezer and saying that even that refutation is only partial. Okay. Na'ana Rabbi Yosef HaGalili ve'amar hechad masinu asur lazeh umutar lazeh asur lakol mutar lakol. Okay, we're recording what Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, his refutation of Rabbi Eliezer is where else do you find anywhere in the Torah that there's something that's same item that's prohibited to one person is permitted to someone else. Rather, once something is prohibited, it's prohibited to everyone. How can you say that this woman is permitted to Shimon but prohibited to Reuven? We don't find examples like that. So now Rava is saying, I can refute all these. Now we're refuting Rabbi Yosef HaGalili. Velo Turuma v'kodashim shasura lazeh muteret lazeh. Turuman kodashim are permitted to kohanim but prohibited to non-kohanim. So there's an example. So no, we mean beisur isha kamrinan. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili was saying within forbidden relations with women. That's what we're talking about. That all those are across the board. Adayot. Wait a second. Regarding adayot, you have a person's sister is prohibited to her brother, but she is permitted to everyone else, right? All adayot are prohibited only to their own relatives, but permitted to non-relatives. So we saw no beishut kamrinan. We mean prohibition of women with regard to marriage, prohibitions that are created through marriage. So we say hare eshet ish. Eshet ish is such a prohibition because eshet ish applies to everyone else in the world except her own husband, right? Doing kiddushin and nisuin permits, right? Asar lanu et arusot v'tir lanu et nesuot lanu. So here you have a married woman. She is permitted to to one person, her husband, and prohibited to everybody else. So there, in fact, is an example of a prohibition that is not across the board, Hainu Pircha, and that is the rejection of Rabbi Yosef HaGalili's argument. Okay, now with Rabbi Yosef HaGalili, we're also going to ask, Ubemai, what case was he assuming? Ilema be'almenat, harehu tara etzlo biznut. If it was a case where the husband said, you're allowed to marry, you're permitted to everyone, on condition that you don't marry Reuven. So if you make a condition, and you say it in that way, on condition that you don't marry Reuven, so that she would only violate if she marries Reuven, but she would not violate if she has promiscuous relations with Reuven. That has other problems, but it would not trigger the condition. And so, in fact, if it's a case of almenat, so it is, in fact, across the board that she is permitted to everyone. And the Rabbi Yosef HaGalili's argument wouldn't work. Rabbi Yosef HaGalili's argument is you can't have a case where she is prohibited to one person but not another person. And although it's true she can't marry the Reuven, she can have promiscuous relations with Reuven, and they'll be permitted in terms of the condition. And so therefore, his argument would not work in such a case. Ela behutz, but if he says chutz, you can marry, you're permitted to everyone except for. So if once he says except for, that includes not only marriage but also zenut, and so that person is totally prohibited. And that's where Rabbi Yosef HaGalili's argument could work. That there's you can't have something that's totally prohibited to one person but permitted to someone else. So he must have been assuming a case of chutz. Okay. Na'ana Rabbi Akiva ve'amar. Now the first of Rabbi Akiva's arguments was Hare shalcha zo ונישאת לאחד מן השוק היו לה בנים, התעלמלה או נתגרשה, ועמדה ונישאת לזה שנאסרה עליו, לא נמצא גט בטל ובניה ממזרים. If he said, don't marry anyone except Reuven. And then she goes and marries some other guy, has children with that other guy, and then he dies. And then should she go back to the first guy, then retroactively her get would have been invalid, and that would make the children mamzerim. Would the Torah allow a situation where a get could cause mamzerim for the next marriage? It's not with Reuven, it's she goes marry someone else. So she was okay according to the condition. And then retroactively it's going to create mamzerim. What was that? Would that be called kiritut? That was Rabbi Akiva's refutation of Rabbi Eliezer. We refute that. Ihachi bechula tenae de'alma name la tinsiv dilma la mekayema le litna'av nimsa get batel baneh mamzerin hainu pircha. It says according to your logic, that would be a problem for any condition that you make in the world. What if the condition is not fulfilled eventually, but in the meantime she married someone else and had children? So then retroactively would not be a get, and there would be mamzerim. So are you going to argue that you can't make any conditions? Right? Everyone agrees that conditional gittin are valid. Husband says, right, this is your get on condition that you pay me $1,000 within the next 10 years. And she, in the meantime, doesn't pay. She has 10 years. She gets married. She has children. Doesn't pay the $1,000. So now, retroactively, after 10 years, her get will be nullified, and she'll be married to the first guy, adultery with the second guy, and mamzerim from the children from the second marriage. And that's a case that everybody agrees is okay. So you can have conditions that will cause retroactively mamzerim. And so this is a rejection of Rabbi Akiva's argument. Now here also we ask, Ubemai, ilama behutz mishra shera Rabbi Eliezer. If we're talking about a case where the husband said, chutz, you can marry anyone except for Reuven, well, then, in that case, in this scenario, she'll be permitted to Reuven, because if she went and married someone else first, then, according to Rabbi Eliezer, she's permitted to go back to Reuven. We already saw this braita. Detanya modeh Rabbi Eliezer b'mgareshet ishto v'amar la harei at mutet l'chol adam chutz mipeloni v'alcha v'niset l'achad ben hashuk v'tamah o nitgaresha shemutet lezeh shene'esra alav ela be'almenat. Rabbi Eliezer agreed that if he divorced his wife and said, don't marry Reuven, and then she goes and marries some other guy not related to Shimon and gets divorced or widowed from that person, then she's permitted to go back to marry Reuven. She just can't marry Reuven next, but she can marry Reuven after a marriage in between. And so this would not be a problem. They would not be mamzerim. Rather, it must be talking about almenat, a condition, and the condition does get undone retroactively if it's not fulfilled later on. So that's what he was assuming. So the first refutation of Rabbi Eliezer, of Rabbi Akiva, applies in a case where the husband used an almenat formula. Now, Davar Acher, Rabbi Akiva's second refutation was Haresh Hayazeh shene'esra alav kohen umet hamegaresh lo nimset almana eslo ugrusha esel kol adam v'kal v'chomer ma gerusha shikala asura mishum sad gerushin sheba eshet ish hamura lo kol sheken. So Rabbi Akiva's second argument was that if let's say the Reuven was a kohen, and afterward, in the meantime, after he gives this get and says you can marry everyone except for Reuven, who's a kohen, and then that first husband dies, so she will, from the perspective of Reuven, she is an almana because she was prohibited to him the whole time because of the marriage to the first husband. So from his perspective, she's still married from the first husband. When he dies, that's an almana. Whereas for everyone else, from their perspective, she is a gerusha because she was allowed to marry everyone else. She was divorced from her husband. And so even after the first husband dies, she remains a gerusha. And the Kal Vachomer was that if the gerusha marrying a kohen, which is a relatively light prohibition, and yet because she is a gerusha with regard to other people, that imposes a prohibition even on Reuven. So all the more so, the prohibition she has with regard to Reuven as an eshet ish, while the husband is alive, she cannot marry the Kohen Reuven, because with regard to him, she is still married to the husband. So all the more so, we should apply that prohibition to everyone else, because it's a more serious prohibition. It's chamura, all the more so. That was Rabbi Akiva's argument. Now we're switching the order of what we're doing. First, we're going to ask what cases it's talking about, and then we will refute it. If this is talking about a case of on condition, there is no prohibition. There's a almenat means you on condition that you don't marry him, but as long as she doesn't marry him, even if they have promiscuous relations, that is not a violation of the condition, and so therefore she is divorced, even with regard to Reuven, because although they can't marry because of that technicality of the condition, it would not be eshet ish if they just slept together not for the purposes of marriage, and therefore she actually is a gerusha, and so you can't make this kal vachomer that technically she's an almana only to him, and not a gerusha, right? So we can't make that argument, which is the source of the kal vachomer, and therefore it can't be talking about a case of almanat ela behutz. So the Rabbi Akiva's second argument applies only assuming that the husband said chutz formula. Now, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Akiva, how does he explain the case, right? The case of the Mishnah that we're talking about, that Rabbi Eliezer, where he gives his opinion. If he thinks Rabbi Eliezer was talking about a case of chutz, so let him give the refutation only for chutz. If he thinks that Rabbi Eliezer was talking about a case of almenat, let him refute only almenat. Why is he providing two different refutations for two different cases? And the answer is Rabbi Akiva shemi'ale de'amar chutz v'ikal de'amar almenat. Man de'amar chutz ha'pircha, uman de'amar almenat ha'pircha. Rabbi Akiva actually learned two different traditions of what Rabbi Eliezer said. In fact, we saw two different traditions. We interpreted the Mishnah to be one way, and we saw Braita that quoted Rabbi Eliezer the other way. So he himself, Rabbi Akiva, already heard those two traditions, and he says, for the one who says chutz, I can refute that one. For the other tradition named Rabbi Eliezer, that he was talking about a case of almenat, I have a refutation for that. See, I can refute it either way. All right, now good. For this last argument, umay pircha, what is the refutation that Ava found to reject it? As follows: Inema isur kihuna shane ha Rabbi Eliezer name me isur kihuna kaimaite le. You'll say that the prohibition for kohanim are prohibited in many things that regular people aren't, and so therefore we're very stringent regarding kohanim. So you might say, you can't make a kal vachomer. You can't compare Isur Kohen and Eshet Ish and say Isur Kohen is a light prohibition, Eshet Ish is a serious prohibition. Even though the punishment for Eshet Ish is much greater than the punishment for a Kohen to marry Gerusha, still you can't compare them because the prohibition of Kohanim has so many stringencies, and therefore you can't compare the two categories. If that's the rejection of Rabbi Akiva, that doesn't work, because Rabbi Eliezer himself, this we saw on yesterday's daf, there were two opinions about the source of Rabbi Eliezer. How does Rabbi Eliezer know that you can make such a divorce that excludes someone and it's still a valid divorce, even though it's only a partial divorce? So one opinion of Rabbi Yochanan is, we learn it from the prohibition of a Kohen marrying a divorcee in the first place, because that pasuk says that a Kohen cannot marry Isha Girusha Me Isha, cannot marry a woman who is divorced from her husband. And Rabbi Eliezer learned from that as long as she's divorced from her husband, even if she's not permitted to anybody else in the world, still a Kohen cannot marry her. And that was the source for his law that this type of get works. So since the source of this very law is from Isur Kehuna, it's perfectly appropriate to compare this law of get to laws of Kohen marrying a divorcee, and therefore this Kal Vachomer totally works. And this would not be a refutation of Rabbi Akiva. So again, what is the refutation of Rabbi Akiva's Kal Vachomer? And the answer is Rava, who's the one that refuted, is making all these refutations. Rabbi Yanai mishum zaken echad kamatneh. Rava must be following the other opinion that we also saw on the previous daf, that the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer is based on a different pasuk. V'yatze'a mi beto v'hayata leish acher. Says if she leaves the first guy's house and she goes and is with another guy, v'hayata leish acher. So the context is she can't go back and marry the first husband. And we learn from there, v'hayata leish acher. It's sufficient that she be permitted to marry even just one other person. Then that is a valid get. According to the Biyanai, the source of the Rabbi Eliezer's law is not from the law of Kohanim, it's from a separate context. Therefore, you can't compare these two categories, and the prohibition of divorce is one category. The prohibition of a Kohen to marry a divorcee is a different category, and follows different principles. And so even if a Kohen can't marry someone because there's some kind of possibility of divorce there, that is not something that you can use for a Kal Vachomer to learn that the divorce is valid for remarriage, because the laws of Kohanim are extra stringent. All right, so there you go. That is the refutation that you cannot make this Kal Vachomer, because the Kal Vachomer is comparing Kohanim to other laws, but Kohanim are in the category in and of themselves with their own stringency, so you can't call that a light prohibition. Oh, good. Now, the end of the Baita said, Amar lehem Rabbi Yoshua, en v'shibin ta'ari la'achar mita. Rabbi Yoshua said, we should not refute the opinion of the lion after he has died. Now, we infer, lememra de Rabbi Yoshua kevate sebira le, v'ayu nami mifrach kaparich. Are you implying that Rabbi Yoshua agrees with Rabbi Eliezer, and he's saying, hey, you can't refute the lion. He would have something to say about each of your refutations, but you can't say after he died. You're not allowed to refute him after he died. That sounds like Rabbi Yoshua agrees with Rabbi Eliezer. Wait a second, but we know that Rabbi Yoshua has his own refutation that we're going to see in a minute. So what does he mean by that? What he actually meant to say is, I also have a refutation against Rabbi Eliezer, but whether it be my refutation or your refutation, we should not talk about them, we should not raise them up, because now he died, and that would not be respectful. Okay, so now we ask, my pircha de Rabbi Yoshua, which is kind of a funny line, right? After saying you shouldn't do that, it's like saying, we shouldn't say any Lashon Hara about that person. Oh, so what Lashon Hara was there to say about that person? Right? And now we are refuting it. Okay, maybe the point is, in that kind of official session, in this public way, not respectful. But Rabbi Yoshua did teach at least one student what his refutation was, because we know it. Tanya. Amar Rabbi Yoshua, Makish kodme havaya sheniya lekodme havaya rishona. Ma kodme havaya rishona de la agida beinish acharina. Af kodme havaya sheniya de la agida beinish acharina. Rabbi Yoshua argues, let's look at this pasuk, the pasuk that we actually derived the get in the first place from. It says, Ki kach ish isha ubalav, a man marries one woman, and he divorces her, and then she leaves his house, v'yatze'a, v'halcha v'hayeta, and she goes and marries a second one. So in back-to-back pasukim, it talks about her marrying the first one with the word yikach, and marrying a second husband with the word hayeta. The point is that if she then divorces that the second husband, she may not go and marry the first husband again. That's the context. But his derivation is from the juxtaposition of the first marriage with the second marriage. And he says, so we're comparing her status before the first marriage to her status before the second marriage. Just like before the first marriage, she was not bound to anyone. She was a single woman, never married before, so not bound to anyone. She can marry anyone anyone who's available. so too her status before the second marriage has to be the same, that she can marry anyone, and that's how that's Rabbi Yeshua's refutation of Rabbi Eliezer. If her status is not the same as it was, pristine, like she was before the marriage, then it's not a good valid divorce. A divorce has to return her to her status before she was married, right? There's a parallel between the marriage and divorce. Divorce has to undo the marriage, and just like before the marriage she was permitted to everyone, so to after the marriage she has to be permitted to everyone. And that is a refutation of Yeshua had, but he didn't offer it at that session. All right, that concludes that whole section of the 5 + 1, 6 refutations, and the refutations of most of those refutations. Gufa. מודה רבי אליעזר מגרש אשתו ואמר לה הרי את מותרת לכל אדם חוץ מפלוני, והלכה ונישאת לאחד מן השוק ונתרמלה או נתגרשה שמותרת לזה שנאסרה עליו. We quoted this Braita already twice, that according to Rabbi Eliezer, if he divorces his wife and says you can marry anybody except for Peloni, it uses the word chutz, and she goes through with that, and she marries Shimon, and then the marriage ends, she's permitted to go back to Reuven because she did it, right? You can't marry anyone except for that. She married someone, not Reuven, and once he did that, then Reuven can be the next husband. Heshib Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar Teshuvah Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer is getting really, everybody wants to refute him. And Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar is refuting this as well. Hechan masinu shezeh oser v'zeh matir. So where do you find a model of a halacha like this, that one person prohibits something and someone else can permit that very same thing? So in this case, the first husband said, you're prohibited to Reuven, but by marrying the second husband, Shimon, Shimon makes her permitted to marry Reuven. How can you have such a case? So so that's Rabbi Eliezer's refutation. Sorry, that's Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar's refutation of Rabbi Eliezer. There's no model of a halacha like that. Now we come to defend Rabbi Eliezer. We say, Vela, v'hadei yevama, debal oser, v'yabam matir. A case of yevama, the husband, by dying and not having children, makes her prohibited to anyone else in the world except for the brother. Ve'yavam, but the brother, who's a yavam, can do either yibum or chalitza. Either if he does chalitza, she can marry, then she's permitted. If he does yibum and then divorces her also or dies, then she is permitted to everyone else. So here you have a case of the first husband makes her prohibited to everyone except Yavam, and the Yavam has the ability to make her permitted to everyone else in the world. So we do have such a model. So we say, no, that's not a good defense of Rabbi Eliezer. Hatam Yavam hu deka'asar la, di mibal ha-sharia v'kayema. In that case, it's actually the Yavam, the living brother, that creates the prohibition. Because if it was only from the husband, let's say the husband didn't have any brothers, he dies without children, then there's no prohibition for the wife. She can marry anyone. So it's not the husband that creates the prohibition, it's the existence of a living brother that creates the prohibition. So since it's the Yavam that makes the prohibition, the Yavam can do Chalitza or Yibum and then divorce her and permit her. Either way. So that's a case where the same person makes a prohibition and a permission. All right. So Harei Nedarim. Wait, we do have another case of one person making a prohibition, another one permitting, and that's in Nedarim. The Noder Oser Chacham Matir. Someone makes a prohibition against on themselves and says, I'm never going to eat fruit, and then they go to the Chacham, and the Chacham permits it. So here we do have a model. That will uphold the refutation of Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar. And we said, no, that's not a good refutation. The Chacham doesn't have his own power just to undo vows without the regret of the person who took the vow. Do you regret that you took the vow? So really it's the regret that undoes the vow. The Chacham is just approving the process and saying, okay, that's a good chadata. Fine, now it can be undone. But the Chacham by himself is not doing it without the participation of the Noder himself. Oh, we do have a model, another one, where if a wife makes a vow and the husband undoes it, even without harata. He doesn't have to ask her, oh, do you feel bad about it? Husband can just undo it unilaterally. So here we do have a case of one person makes a prohibition and someone else permits it. Hatam k'Rab Pinchas mishmei derava, damar Rab Pinchas mishmei derava, kol hanoderet al dat ba'ala hinoderet. Now there we can follow this statement that says, whenever a wife makes a vow, it's on with the husband in mind. She's saying it, I'm making this vow, assuming that my husband will be okay with it and won't undo it. Since she has that in mind to begin with, it's like a condition that she herself is making, that she says this will only be valid if my husband agrees to it. So that's the mechanism. And therefore, it's really not an example of one person prohibiting and the other person permitting, and therefore you're right, we don't find the case where one person can prohibit and a different person can permit, and therefore this is a valid refutation against Rabbi Eliezer. Now, not Rabbi Eliezer and Azariah Amar, Kiritut Tavara Koret Beno Lebena, Halamadata She'en Ze Karet. Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah was the only one we didn't refute. His derivation was from the word kiritut, has to be something that absolutely separates the husband and the wife. Okay, that was his source. Seems like a good source. V'Rabbanan, hai kiritut, mai avdi le. According to the other 4 rabbis in that list who brought other refutations, they didn't bring this refutation. So obviously they think that this word, this kiritut, would not be a valid refutation of Rabbi Eliezer. Well, how do they interpret this word kiritut? What do they learn from it? מבעלה לכדתניא, הרי זה גיתך על מנת שלא תשתי יין, על מנת שלא תלכי לבית אביך לעולם, אין זה כריתות, 30 יום, הרי זה כריתות. They need it for the following beraita. If a husband says, here is your get on condition that you never drink wine again, or on condition that you never go to your father's house ever again, that is not a separation, because he has strings attached, and it's a never-ending condition. And so, for her whole life, any time, if she has a drink of wine, retroactively it will annul the get. That's not called a separation. If there is a time limit, that's okay, right? It says don't drink wine for 30 days. Okay, there will be, since there's a time limit, after 30 days, it will be an absolute severance. So there has to be some point in time that the severance kicks in absolutely without any possibility of being undone. So that the rabbis learned from the word kiritut, it has to be a time limit on any condition. V'idach, now Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah, doesn't he agree with this halacha? Where is he going to learn it from? Mikaret kiritut nafka, from the doubling, the plural of, it's not really plural, karet, but the kiritut, the compound word, it could have just said sefer karet. Why sefer kiritut, the long form of this noun? The long form teaches that you can learn 2 things, karet and the long form kiritut. So that's how he learns both, that there has to a condition has to have a time limit, and also it has to permit her to everyone in the world, against Rabbi Eliezer. V'idach, and the other rabbis, karet kiritut la darshe, they don't learn anything from the elongated version of this noun. It's just a word. It's a noun form. It's a regular noun form, and therefore we don't learn anything new from it. Amar Rava, הרי זה גיתך על מנת שלא תשתי יין כל ימי חיי, אין זה כריתות. כל ימי חיי פלוני, הרי זה כריתות. Now we're going to analyze what exactly is a valid time limit. Yeah, if you say 30 days, okay, that's a fixed time limit. But if you make it dependent on how long a certain person lives. So Rava says, if the husband says, here is your get, on condition that you don't drink wine all the days of my life, that's not valid. But if he says, you cannot drink wine as long as Reuven lives, then that is a kiritut, because Reuven will die eventually. We don't know when, but then after he dies, then it's the get becomes permanent. So now we ask, so what's the difference between the 2 cases? If you do the life of Reuven, so that's valid because maybe he'll die before she dies, and therefore they will fulfill the condition. The same is true for the husband. If he says, upon my life, so maybe the husband will die before her, and then the that will fulfill the condition. So it should be the same thing. Ela ema, rather, we got Rava's statement wrong. Here's what he meant to say. Kol yemei chayaychi en ze keritut. Kol yemei chayai o chaye peloni hare ze keritut. If the husband says you may not drink wine all the days of your life, the wife's life, well, that's not, it's a severance, because so she's permitted to drink wine after she dies for tchiyat metim? No, because that condition is going to be valid all of her life. Then, so there will never be a time during her lifetime when the condition is totally fulfilled. So that's invalid. But if he says anybody else's life, whether it's husband's own life or some stranger's life, so it could be, not necessarily, but it could be that person will predecease that wife, and then it will be a permanent severance. As long as the possibility of a permanent severance, the get is valid. Nachman. Hayom I at ishti ulmachar at ishti mahu. A husband says, today you are not my wife. In other words, here's a get, and today you are not my wife at all. You can marry anyone in the world. So that would be a valid get. But then he adds, and tomorrow you are my wife. Okay, it doesn't mean that he's going to do kiddushin again tomorrow. The point of saying tomorrow you are prohibited to everyone, right, as my wife. So is that a valid get or not? Because on the first day, she is in fact permitted to everyone, but it just has a time limit, and then she's going to be prohibited to everyone. So, tibai Rabbi Eliezer, tibai Rabbanan. Well, let's analyze this question both according to Rabbi Eliezer and according to Rabbanan. Tibai Rabbi Eliezer ad kan lo kamal Rabbi Eliezer atam ela de leman de kashareh le'olam, aval hacha lo o dilma lo shena. Rabbi Eliezer was lenient in the case of making an exception for someone. So maybe we would say for Rabbi Eliezer only made that leniency if the husband says you're permitted to everyone except the Reuven, because for all the other people in the world, she is prohibited to them forever. And so, although Rabbi Eliezer permits the set of men to be limited, he still requires the time to be forever. And so he would not apply a leniency if there's any time restriction. Or maybe he would say, there's no different than just like you can limit the number of people, you can also limit the time and say you're permitted today, but not tomorrow. That's the two sides for the Eliezer. Tebae le Rabbanan ad kan la kamre Rabbanan hatam ela de la pesaka mine le gamre avalacha kevan de pesaka. According to Rabbanan, maybe the rabbis are only stringent in the case where the husband says you can marry everyone except the Reuven, because they are not entirely separated. He's still connected to her. He's still married to her with respect to Reuven, and so that case is no good. But here, since on today there's a total separation and she can marry everyone, so then the get sets in and is valid for that day, even though there's a time limit. So maybe Rabbanan would be mekel. Or the other side, doesn't say the other side, but the other side would be obvious, is that Rabbanan say you can't make any limitations at all, not on the number of men and not on the time at all. If you make any limitations, it's an invalid get. All right, that's the two sides of the question. Bata de ba'aya hadar peshata mistabera ben Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbanan kevan de pesaka. After Rava raised the question, he gave an answer himself, and he said it makes sense both according to Rabbi Eliezer and according to Rabbanan. Once he made a separation and said you are permitted to everyone today, then that is a valid get, right? It's a valid get, and so she better go hurry up and find a guy and do a shotgun wedding that day, because this permission is time limited. But because right now she is permitted to everyone, therefore it's a valid get, both according to Eliezer and even according to Rabbanan. Baruch Adonai L'Olam. Amen ve'amen.